Max Gagliardi, and you're listening to the Talk Energy podcast. If you're watching this video, take a moment, hit the subscribe button on YouTube, or you can follow me on your favorite podcast app, leave a review, help me out. And for those of you that are tuning in on the podcast app, I just want to tell you the numbers have been better than they've ever been. I really appreciate you guys. Every week, consistently, people are tuning in, and it just means a lot to me. Thank you so much. This episode's guest is Matt Warder. Matt is the founder of Seawolf Research, where he covers the metals and mining space. I found Matt on coal Twitter, and he's completely opened my eyes to this entire world of Twitter that I didn't know existed, and I should have, because you've got Twitter for oil and gas and energy and all these other things. I'm just really excited that he helped me break into that scene. It's been great to follow. This episode, we discuss the current state of the coal industry. We talk about the current conflict in Europe and how it's impacting the world's mining and metal space. And lastly, we discuss the energy transition and how if the world is going to move off of hydrocarbons, then we're going to need a lot more mining. Hope you enjoy the show. Matt, welcome to Talk Energy. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me, Max. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
it's not not a whole lot of people who generally want to talk about about coal within the energy markets here the last few years, and boy, over the last 12 months, has it just become really important for people to at least be moderately aware of. So appreciate the chance to come on and talk about.
No, it's great. I think I posted at one point, sometime on Twitter, I was like, man, I want to do more coal content, and you reached out and. Threw me a few names, but then I'd been following you and actually liked your content. I was like, let's do some. And it just seems to be like in this, connected world that we're in, all the craziness happening in the mining and metal space. It's a very topical discussion that we can have here. But before we kick off into it, just maybe like a brief history on your background and, really just like these markets, like your background and then these markets during your career and how things have evolved.
So starting way back, I actually started off in the music industry, and part of the deal with being in the music industry is you make a modicum of your income from. I was in a band called The Argument for about 10 years. Made a little bit of income from touring, record sales, those sorts of things. But mostly we were teachers, right? Mm-hmm. So when we weren't touring, I had a private studio. Some of us taught in the school system, those sorts of things. And when we were on a small label out of Pittsburgh at the end of our career, along with Wiz Khalifa, Mac Miller, and a few other people, interestingly enough. But when we decided to sort of wind that down, for me, my undergraduate degrees are in chemistry and in music, and so I was trying to looking to do something more along the that had more to do with my kind of math and science background. And one of my guitar students worked for a consulting firm out here in the Annapolis area, which is where I live now, that specialized in coal markets. So I started learning the coal industry is right around 2006, 2007 from the ground up. And the study that I worked on was Central Appalachia. And Central Appalachia, which is, if you think about southern West Virginia, Kentucky, was that is the largest area in the country that produces metallurgical coal. So here I am starting off, and I have to learn not just one industry that is enormous, but also I have to understand steel to some degree, and I have to understand the power sector. I think when I started off, there were probably 1,400 mines just in Central Appalachia, not including Pennsylvania, Maryland, or out in the Illinois Basin, or out in Powder River Basin, but just 1,400 mines in that area. So I got a little bit of exposure to big data handling, and amalgamating larger data sets and trying to work with larger data sets to do kind of more kind of mid-level analysis, broader and cover broader trends. So that was pretty interesting. A few months into my tenure there, we were the company that I worked for, Hill and Associates, was bought by global consultancy Wood Mackenzie. So just in the span of a few months, I went from being a musician working in the music industry to being a data analyst for a small firm, and then all of a sudden working for this global consultancy. And obviously, when Wood Mac came in, that allowed me the opportunity to move up through the ranks. My boss who hired me had moved on to a bigger job covering markets. So myself and a lot of the other juniors that worked for Wood Mac at the time, Natalie Biggs being one of them, who's also pretty active on coal Twitter. We basically took the reins and took it from there, covering both supply side and markets. And then I think it was a couple of years later, Wood Mac bought a company called Brook Hunt, which did metals, base metals, and precious metals consultancy. And they decided to kind of combine the two, put the peanut butter with the jelly, so to speak. And we built out iron ore and steel coverage. So I raised my hand, volunteered to do that, and helped build up Wood Mackenzie's asset by asset coverage in the ferrous space too. Now, the cool thing about doing that is, I have had one commodity, a modicum of expertise in that, and then you start layering on these other commodities that are related, but not necessarily, directly related. They're partially involved in the cost structure. Well, by the time you get up to the top of the food chain there with steel, the commodity cycle kind of circles back around to oil, because at the time I think steel, tube and pipe was about 2/3 of drilling and completion costs. From there, all of a sudden you develop this superpower of, cross commodity analysis, whereby, maybe I'm not quite as well versed even on iron ore and steel as I am in coal, but that starts to, turn on your macro level awareness. It starts to, help you understand where macroeconomics and commodities and consumer cycles sort of intersect. And, for most of the rest of my career, which has been split between just pure natural resource analysis and also doing primary financial research for the retail newsletter industry. It's been a really fantastic skill set that I'm grateful to have been exposed to at such a great corporate level.
Yeah, it's a really cool background, one that I don't have a ton of experience in, and I think just for me to frame up the rest of the conversation, just how things have changed kind of high level. And, I'm sure a lot has changed, but just since you started in this space to today, what are some of the major themes that you've seen? And then we'll talk about themes into the future.
Right. Well, I mean, from my perspective, the coal industry is kind of a microcosm of what's happened broadly in energy in general. So we've had, when I joined, so this is the end of the Bush administration, 2006, 2007. And the beginning of the Obama administration, and I'm completely green. But we go from a relatively supportive environment for fossil fuel power generation to one that's clearly sits on the opposite side of the aisle with regard to that. And so we entered into this era where regulations on coal mining in particular became increasingly stringent. From an economic perspective, it was sort of strange because building a gas plant to replace coal capacity was cheaper, by a lot, by about 50%. So it made more sense just from an economic perspective to sort of let it go. But especially after the Upper Big Branch explosion at that massive mine in West Virginia in 2000, I can't remember if it was 2010 or 2011, that sort of gave the Obama administration political capital to ramp up inspections at other operations. And Central Appalachia, which is historically, well mined. I mean, the industry there goes back to the early 1800s. And all of the great reserves, like in every other, older deposits have been mined out, and the seams are really thin. So they're very high up on the cost curve. When you start to add in other cost pressures, then when you get to the other side of the price cycle, we had to move up to about $300 a ton for met coal in 2007 during a series of floods in Australia. Well, on the other side of that, when you're getting pressures from a margin perspective, well, those who are less well capitalized don't really make it through the cycle. So we saw a lot of mine closures on the back half of that. And then even after the next boom cycle, we just see these massive amounts of bankruptcies after a lot of mergers and acquisitions kind of happened at the top. And being a West Virginian, when you drive down through the southern part of the state, I mean, I didn't realize how kind of connected the broader economy was to those jobs, right? Because some of those guys don't go to high school, but they can step into a coal operation, make 70, 80, sometimes 60, and as those jobs went away, like you just saw this kind of decay within the communities, which is really sad to see. And we've seen a little bit of that on the other side of 2016 and the energy bust in the oil patch. So really, I mean, coal kind of like was foreshadowing the sort of political resistance that we've seen in the fossil fuel industry from an asset level perspective. And now that we've kind of hit critical mass, in coal and post-pandemic, even in oil and gas production, we're starting to see a lot of these things play out as shortages. When the cycle turns and demand goes up, but we've, from a regulatory perspective, we've pushed down on supply to the point where supply cannot respond elastically to increases in demand, then we have a real fundamental problem,
right?
In order to address that in the market. And I got active, really on Twitter right around the time that was really a concern. Coal stockpiles were really dwindling in the middle of last summer, and natural gas inventories were as well, just because we had a lot of demand and there wasn't enough production capacity in the market to replenish, those reserves as we move through the summer.
How much of what was happening in the coal markets here domestically in the U.S. was driven by policy changes and regulations versus just true economics of natural gas and natural gas power generation? Was it an even mix? Was it driven mostly by nat gas and that new supply? Or just kind of give me those dynamics. How much of it was free market versus just the regulatory pressures?
I mean, when I joined the industry, the writing was on the wall with regard to natural gas. So, we knew that these coal plants were going to retire. We knew that it was economically more viable to build natural gas plants as opposed to coal plants going forward in the power sector. Like that was well known by the time I joined. So, it wasn't necessarily a surprise. Where regulation comes in is regulation can pull forward a lot of those changes that would happen under normal circumstances economically. And that's really what wound up happening. As soon as we sort of tightened the regulatory screws to some degree, we started to see, mines that were at the upper end of the cost curve begin to drop out, which had, sort of the effects that we said. So, if I had to put a number on it, I mean, let's just call it 50-50, because it probably would have happened over time from an economic perspective anyway. It's just that, now we're in this process of decarbonization, and from a policy perspective, we're doing the same thing, right? We're not allowing supply to respond in a way that's meaningful for price in the near term, because we're taking a look at 2040 and saying, well, we want to achieve these goals by then. Well, the path to 2040, you have to go through 2022 and 2023 and 2024. And so that development, really has to be project managed. And, if you think about it from a governmental perspective, where we've gone from, extreme right to extreme left, well, the bureaucrats that are in charge of managing that project, change at the drop of a dime. And there's no way we can have as a culture, as an energy market, any kind of continuity when we're vacillating back and forth between those extremes like that.
Right. How much is, I see about this a lot more earlier in my career. I'd hear about it a lot, and you still hear about it today, this phenomenon of coal to gas switching. When the price of gas gets to a certain point, you've got coal stepping in and playing a bigger role. Is that still happening to the effect or to the amount that it did, say 10 years ago? Is as coal plants have been shuttered and as the coal supply has been less reliable or has been gone down because of these things you've talked about, is that becoming more of a thing? I just haven't seen as many headlines on the coal to gas switching, but just talk about that for a minute and where you see that going into the future.
Sure. Well, supply's been cut in half, or I think even more so relative to when I started. So there's less of it just in general. There's less coal-fired generation to switch. So there's less of it in general. And then when you have a situation like we had last summer, where natural gas prices go from $2.50 or below, which at that point in time, natural gas is entirely the base load fleet, right? And as soon as that gets up to about $2.50 or $3, that's when kind of the pricing dynamics begin to switch in favor of coal. Right. And at $4 and $5, pretty much everything favors coal. But the problem is now we don't have any supply to ramp up to satisfy that. So utilities are forced to burn down their inventories, which they can't replenish at the same rate. So it happened already. It has happened now. Like economics favor coal right now. And as long as gas is going to be up in the $5.50, $4.50 range, it's going to, and we're going to have this kind of like inventory battle between, do we have enough coal supply? Do we have enough, gas inventories, and can production for both commodities keep up with demand?
Yeah, that's what I was going to wonder. Is that it seems like today at these prices, it would be incentivizing coal, but to the extent that we have the supply, and I don't even track the price of coal, and maybe talk a little bit about those markets, how that, how coal is marketed and sold, spot prices, forwards, all these things. Like, I'm very familiar with gas and
Sure.
oil, but give us a sense of that side of the market, how the stuff is bought and sold, and where price is at
Right.
today. What's been going on?
So from a power perspective, coal is generally sold on an annual basis to the utility industry, right? And there's a few reasons for that, but chief among them is that you have to be able to plan your labor out. So you have to hit monthly, weekly production targets, and you have to know what you're going to do at the very least quarter by quarter. And if you're running a publicly traded company like a lot of these guys are, then you do have to leave a little bit of room on the upside to capture anything that happens in the export market. So you have to plan in, work in a little bit of the ability to increase production up by, call it 5-10%, and mostly because we not only right now do we have difficulty with the capacity that we do have, we also have a labor shortage. So even if you wanted to bring on another crew, well, going out and trying to hire them at the mine level is nigh on impossible. And then the flip side of that is the rail also has to do that, right? Because the rail has to service your operation. So the rail needs to increase labor capacity, and they're drawing from a very similarly tight labor pool. So if you can't increase supply at the mine, and then you also can't increase your service capacity from a rail perspective, then it's going to be hard to manage. So coal prices in general, like when we see spot prices or people talk about them, that's not really representative of where a contract would be signed.
Mm-hmm.
A contract would be signed like right now. Central app spot prices are three digits. So there's not a lot of thermal coal produced down there, but it's $120, $130. And then just looking at Northern Appalachian coal, so this would be companies like Consol, CEIX ticker. They're also up in the $120, $130 range. If you wanted to sign a contract for Q4 right now for quarterly delivery, you'd be paying still triple digits. And to give you an idea, historically, like the average price I think historically is like $40.
Wow.
So we're in just unprecedented territory I've never seen before in my career. Now, from a contract perspective, if Consol came into the market and they looked at this forward curve and a utility really needed to run stockpiles, they'd say, okay, well, all right, maybe we'll supply you at a favorable rate for 2022, but in 2023 when the price is, call it $60, $65, how about you give me 68, 69, and we'll split the difference like that over those 2 years. That's kind of how a lot of folks try to do business because they want the utilities to be online next year so they can produce.
Right.
So it's a give and take. What we see kind of bandied about in the market are just spot tons, and for all rhetorical purposes, the spot price is infinity. You can't get a spot ton because there's not one available on the market.
Yeah, that's wild. It's just everything is up, energy across the board, commodities across the board, and we'll get into the global stuff here in a bit. But just taking it back still in the U.S. domestically, what are the second and third order effects of the coal industry changing like it has over the last couple decades? I mean, how does that ripple through to other industries like steel you'd mentioned, and just our ability to be competitive in manufacturing and some of these other processes that may require coal that other places in the world might be able to have a better advantage than they used to against the U.S. But just talk about the second, third order effects of things changing like they have.
Sure. Well, the first knock-on effect is electricity prices. So if electricity prices are up, then manufacturing prices are up ipso facto. That's just how it is. There are more industries. Some industries are more. Electricity is going to be a bigger cost component of. With regard to steel. If you want to move up that value chain, where thermal coal kind of plays into the steel market is through, we have two types of steel manufacturing processes. There's blast furnace, which takes coking coal, agglomerates it into coke, carbon, right? And that coke holds up layers of iron ore, FeO2, and the carbon, the coke serves as both a reductant, so the carbon will pick off an oxygen off of the iron ore burden, and that'll leave molten iron oxide, FeO, that trickles down to the bottom of the blast furnace where you can capture it, right? And then also we melt scrap steel in electric arc furnaces, which obviously electricity is a huge cost component in an electric arc furnace. So the electricity prices are higher, then the cost of melting scrap steel is also going to be higher. Um, coal can affect prices either through the electric arc furnace route and steel recyclers, or from a metallurgical coal perspective. If metallurgical coal prices go up, then the cost of the reductant for blast furnace operations also rises. So it can hit both sides of it.
So is it fair to say that we are less competitive than other areas, given where our coal industry has gone in terms of some of these manufacturing processes, or is it not that cut and dry? Can nat gas and other things kind of step in and fill that role?
I guess we probably ought to pick one vertical and kind of go with it. If we talk broad manufacturing, for me, it's hard to say. I mean, our labor costs are so much higher than they are in China, for instance, that I think labor would be a bigger component for broader manufacturing.
That's a good point.
But if we just think about steel, our steel market is largely contained, right? Here in North America, Canada produces a few million tons a year. We produce about 100, 110, somewhere along in there. That's split between I can't remember if it's 60-40 EAF to blast furnace, but there's a split there. We mostly take care of ourselves. We have to take in a little bit of steel from the rest of the world in order to help satisfy our demand. We used to import a lot of, let's say a lot, but we used to import a couple million tons of tube and pipe from South Korea. But during Trump's trade war, when we put tariffs on overseas steel, now that has an iterative effect too. So, bottom line is I think it just depends. I don't think you can make one blanket statement either way. I think for our market here, we're pretty insulated and we're competitive within ourselves. If we want to reshore other manufacturing, we're going to have to think about how to bring that labor cost down. And, most likely, I think for us, it's probably going to be through automation. But that sort of cost discussion is probably getting above my pay grade, as it were.
Sure. What about just switching to the power side for a minute, and we'll just keep going here on the U.S. for just a few more questions. But where are the parts of the U.S. that are still the most heavily reliant on coal for power gen?
In the middle of the country, you still mine a significant amount of tonnage in the PRB. Some of that stays home, but a lot of that goes down into the southern markets in Texas, right? Yep. In addition to that, we have kind of the PJM area, kind of central U.S. That still takes a lot of northern Appalachian coal, and we still burn a lot of coal in the southeastern states as well. Duke Energy still has some plants down there, but the plants in the southeast that used to be reliant mostly on central Appalachian coal, thermal coal. Those have either already retired or they've made adjustments with regard to their fuel mix to be able to take a broader mix of everything else. And of course, Illinois Basin still a huge provider to the Midwest and in the sort of like south central United States as well.
For sure. Pivoting over to international stuff, what's going on? We look at what's happening with Russia and Ukraine and all the crazy commodity disruptions in the world. How does this fit into what you do and your, maybe give your kind of high level take on things? And I don't know, I know you do consulting. I don't know exactly what all your consulting is based around, and we can get into that later, but just talk about the world right now, and your take on, coal and metals and mining and how it relates to what's going on with Russia and Ukraine.
Sure. Let's the easiest way to sort of get into that is to talk about the United States' traditional role in export coal markets, right? Okay. So we traditionally had a lot of supply elasticity, right? We could, bring on additional production, back in the day. We can restart old mines that had been, put on hot idle. We can bring those back within, a couple of months. The combination of, the bankruptcies post 2016, really the downturn in coal markets after that. And then you layer the pandemic on top of that. That has stripped away our, to respond to be the swing supplier into the global market now. So, when global demand goes through the moon, like we saw it happen in Europe, here over the course of the past year with TTF prices, at these just moonshot levels, that should incentivize, coal imports, and it has. But, the U.S. can't step in anymore and put out that fire from a pricing perspective. So now when we have these demand shocks or supply shocks, whichever side they occur on in the global market, there's just no upside to production in order to be able to put it out. So when we have China ramping up and deciding not to take Australian coal, Australian trade flows work their way up into India, through the rest of Asia, up into Europe. For China to replace Australia it took 3 to 4 months, and they replaced it with a combination of increased Russian exports, increased Russian imports, increased imports from Mongolia, and then they took only a small amount of coal from Canada historically. They've really barely taken any from the U.S. From 2016 on. So now they're taking about 1 million tons a month or thereabouts. So that was a big sort of step change. But because the U.S. and Canada really can't increase production, if you take 1 million tons out of those markets, well, now all of a sudden Europe and Brazil and other markets have to pay a little bit more for their coal. So when an imbalance happens in the coal market now and prices rise, it is very difficult for them to move on the other side of that cycle without a corresponding decrease in demand. And that decrease in demand can come seasonally, or for steel, it's more a restocking cycle. So China's restocking here post Olympics. So we're going to see prices in China probably rise for about 2 or 3 months, and we're going to see a lull until the fall or early winter, and then they'll step back into the market. For power, it's same sort of shoulder season, demand season dynamic that we see in natural gas and those sorts of things. But if supply can't respond, then prices are going to stick higher. That's really what it is. We're seeing that across the commodity spectrum, and it's one of the reasons why inflation, has been really, really sticky up here at this, 8% level here in the U.S. in particular, but all over the world.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it just seems like across the board, commodities are going higher. I don't know how much. It's such a complicated, interconnected marketplace.
Yeah,
and to me, I don't know on the coal specifically, but what I anecdotally see is that, it still makes up a huge percentage of the world's energy use, right? This is still a massive amount of the electricity generated. And it seems like when we hear the narratives in the U.S. that coal is dead, it seems like that may be, to use the Mark Twain quote where it's rumors
of my death may have been premature.
Has been greatly
exaggerated.
Yeah, greatly exaggerated or whatever it is. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It seems like that because you look at coal in China, they're still continuing to build just tons of coal, fired power generation. It seems like coal is going to continue to play one of the biggest roles in the future of the energy mix of the world, but you don't hear that talking point a lot. Is that fair or not?
Yeah, well, really what we're talking about when we're talking about the energy transition is the transition of developed economies, right? Developed economies, Europe and the United States, have made the decision to move away in that direction. And to some degree, we have the wealth and the ability to do so. What we don't have is central planning and forced adoption and those types of things. Because we like free markets, which I think is a good thing. But in Asia, Asia's still developing. Africa's still developing. So those nations are going to rely more heavily on cheap energy or cheaper energy, comparatively cheaper energy, as they continue to develop than other people are. That's just the natural order of things. If there's a technological breakthrough or additional materials availability that comes from the green sector, I think that's a conversation we could probably have on down the road. But like I was talking before about project management, you have to progress from 2021 to 2022, and you have to work with the materials right now that are available to you right now. And that's developed economies, I guess if they want to, can put the cart before the horse, until they run out of material. But for developing economies, you have to understand that coal is going to be at least a reasonably sizable part of your energy mix, over the next 10 to 20 years. Now, hopefully, from a climate perspective, developed economies can get supplies and gear to offset that to some degree, so we can try to keep on a 2 degree Celsius target. But with and kind of moving back over to Russia, if we're going to have these conflicts that involve nations that are significant producers of hydrocarbons, now we have to have a trade flow discussion, and we have to set, what does success look like in terms of, carbon emissions for the next 2 years if we're going to choose to not take, additional hydrocarbons from Russia, and we're going to choose to adjust those trade flows. I think probably expectations at the political level need to be reset, at least for a short period of time, while we work out what these supply chains look like.
How does this, with Europe now, energy security being very, very much in focus, and this idea that they can try to rapidly or as quick as they can diversify away from Russia? Primarily, it looks to be natural gas is the big one. Russia's the largest exporter of nat gas in the world, 80% of which goes west into Europe. Countries like Germany, et cetera, really pin themselves to Russian hydrocarbons. Can you see, or were you alluding that maybe to fill this gap in the near term, we're going to see a higher reliance on coal in that energy mix to be able to shore up security and make sure that the citizens of those countries can have access to cheap and reliable energy here, at least in the near to medium term? Or is that something they have the ability to do, or the political will?
I think they're going to be obligated to. We saw in Texas, last February, whereby how dispatch really works. And you talked about this a little bit when you had Meredith Anglin on your podcast too, right? How dispatch works is, it goes base load first. So if solar and wind are dispatching, they go. So that goes out the door. The remainder is going to be, what is in our base load fleet right now that's operating? So, for the most part, that's going to be natural gas. So if you can't dispatch enough natural gas, then you have to move on down the chain, right? So that means, if not natural gas, then coal and nuclear or diesel. Pick your backup, but it's going to be a fossil fuel, or it's going to be nuclear. That's what happens when you start to exhaust those options and demand is really high. So when you have a situation like in Texas where natural gas gets diverted to heat homes first, which it should. People should be safe first and foremost. And if their homes are heated by natural gas, at least they're going to be warm. Maybe we have problems from a power perspective, but at least they can heat their homes. I think that's completely reasonable and correct. But if that supply gets diverted, then your baseload, the baseload capacity, effective baseload capacity for natural gas decreases. So you have to rely more on coal, or more on natural gas, or more on diesel when renewables don't dispatch. And I'm relatively liberal, I think, compared to a lot of other people in the industry. But from an operational project management perspective, you can't play on teams like that. You have to be beholden to solving the problem. And the problem is we don't have enough generation capacity to withstand those kind of second and third degree standard deviation tail risk events for the grid. Right. Just pigeonholing renewables into that top level collectible doesn't really work from a risk management perspective right now. So we either need some level of redundancy in natural gas generation here. We need some level of redundancy on coal. We need some level of redundancy on diesel or nuclear to bridge the gap until we can actually get to a point where we can sort of dispatch. I kind of moved in a little bit different direction with that question, but I think that's the that's the point, and why coal is going to be, I think, more important for folks all over the world going forward than I think I would have even thought 5, 6, 7 years ago.
There's a huge value premium to being able to store the energy on site. I hadn't thought about this a lot until I got into more, focusing on the grid, focusing on reliable versus unreliable energy. And I don't just mean renewables. I mean, sometimes nat gas, if you have a big storm, or if you're beholden to a political actor like Russia, these things have to be moved and dispatched at the time when they're needed. And so there is a reason why coal has been such a great resource the last century and beyond, even before then, is because of this ability to store that energy on site. You can the way to transport coal is a lot more flexible. I mean, you can obviously use rail, in theory, trucks. I mean, I don't know. It's probably primarily rail, given how much you need. But still, it's like in this age of this kind of energy crisis that we're going through, if that's what I think we can call it. I think most people will call it that now. I think 6 months ago, people were hesitant to call it an energy crisis. I feel like now people are using that pretty frequently, even in the mainstream. It seems like coal would be a pretty critical piece to the puzzle on at least solving some of these problems near and medium term, just because that's an amazing property that you can transport it like that and you can store it on site. And a lot of people don't think of it in those terms, but it's a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind,
right? I mean,
it's in my mind, like right now, coal is kind of an insurance policy for developed market grids, the whole world around. And so, at least in my opinion, we need to have a little bit more flexible, political lens through which we view it as a culture, both here and in Europe, because if we're going to be politically in a position where governments do what they think is morally correct with regard to relying on regimes that are unfriendly, then there just aren't really any other options right now to rely on. It's like, well, you got natural gas, you got coal, you got diesel, and nuclear. Pick one and
right.
Do the best you can with it. France has a really good nuclear infrastructure, so they're going to lean more that way. Which I'm a huge proponent of that. I think going forward from a climate perspective, it's still sort of shocking to me that the progressive movement really hasn't embraced nuclear more than it has, particularly like small modular nuclear reactors that we could bring on incrementally over the years. We're starting to see a little bit more of that, but the way that I view it is the more flexibility we can have in the near term with regard to energy generation, the better we can navigate the near term when we do wind up with these shortages, whether it's in hydrocarbons or whether it's in critical metals or these other things. The more options we have, the more redundancy we have, and the more honest we are about having the conversation that we may need, all of the above. I think we'll all fare better, in the U.S. and Europe in the near term.
Absolutely. Well, and I mean, like this move to a lot of renewables, I don't know, people have said it's 1-to-1 what you need in terms of base load versus renewable capacity. Others will argue that it's not anywhere near that. I hear smart people making good arguments on both sides, but in my mind, it is putting base load and reliable base load more and more at the focus of security because, there's some tweets this weekend of someone who worked at a power plant in Texas, and they're like, look, it's madness. Like all this wind is coming on, and it's coming on at times when we don't need it. Energy prices are going negative. And so we're being told to shut off, even though we've got, what they believe the cheapest, should be the cheapest form of energy. But it's not because of all these inefficiencies in the grid and the marketplace. So it seems like there's going to be more and more focus on a base load and the importance of base load and reliable and the ability for it to be there. And I think shifting to kind of talk about the energy transition a little bit, I don't know how much you cover in the mining space outside of the coal markets, but it just seems like mining right now, and at least into the foreseeable future, is going to be more and more into the spotlight. I mean, am I right? Just with everything the way the world is trying to go.
Yep. Oh yeah, and it doesn't necessarily matter like what commodity you kind of want to dive into. Whether that's copper or nickel. Right. With in their relationship to electric vehicle adoption, or batteries in general, or battery storage. Russia is a pretty huge supplier of all that. So, if
I was going to see what's your expertise. Yeah, go ahead. I was going to say, outside of coal, what is your expertise in the other metals? Go ahead, because I don't know. I mean, I can pick on certain topics, but I want you to go where you're comfortable going with it.
Yeah, so I cover pretty much all natural resources at this point in time. After I left Wood Mac, I headed up a research group for a retail financial publication, and as part of my remit there, I actually authored a newsletter with Rick Rule from Sprott Global. And in it, we covered, oil and gas. We covered base metals and precious metals and uranium and cobalt and battery metals and all of these other markets I'd never really done before. So I had to get, this is 2016 through late 2019. So I had to get up to speed and literate on pretty much all of those metals, all of those markets, how they interconnect with one another. I wouldn't call myself an expert in one of them, but I can certainly talk about how they intersect with other industrial commodities, how that supply chain sort of works, whether they can drive primary mining economics, those types of things. So I'm pretty comfortable kind of moving back and forth with that. I mean, but no matter how we slice it, there are two. Whether we're talking about coal or base metals or battery metals, there are two things that are really important. One is that Russia produces a heck of a lot of those critical materials in general, right? For coal, Russia's right around, I want to say, 175 million tons of exports into the market. About 30 million of that is metallurgical coal, and a lot of that goes into China, but there was a lot going into Japan and South Korea and Europe. I want to say Russia accounted for maybe 30% of Europe's metallurgical coal imports, 20%, and probably 50% of its coal imports for the power sector. So, I want to say Norilsk is, call it 10%, 15% of global nickel supply. Norilsk is going to be a hugely important supplier to the electric vehicle battery industry, for instance. There just aren't a lot of nickel producers at scale. I mean, you have Vale's operations, you have a few other producers, but Norilsk is really the kind of the big dog in the room. So, from a geopolitical perspective, if we're going to move down the path of battery storage at a grid scale and EV adoption, like we have to, as a developed world, figure out how we're going to interact with Russia or how those trade flows adjust. With regard to coal, how I think they're going to adjust is from a met perspective going into China. Russia and China can continue to do business, right? Russia and India can continue to do business. We're going to allow both of those countries to do that. We're not going to step in and do anything. Europe may choose not to, right? But if you add it up from a met coal perspective, Europe plus South Korea plus Japan, you get to about 23 to 25 million tons per year of demand. China right now, for instance, is taking about 1 million ton a month from the U.S., 1 million tons a month from Canada. So if China takes in most of the Russian coal, imports additional coal from Mongolia, that frees up, about the same amount of coal from the U.S. and Canada, which is a good quality to replace, good enough quality to replace it, to be distributed amongst those three countries without, really undoing global trade flows. But all that's got to take place here within the next 3 months. Like when we start getting into, battery metals, and, we haven't capitalized anywhere near the amount of metals operations that we'll need to power the electric vehicle transition, even alone. I mean, at its peak, I want to say we're going to force maybe 20 million cars per year, to go over to EVs. If we do that at current, at the current rate of copper production, that's like a quarter of global supply. So, we have to capitalize a whole lot of mines, and we have to be incredibly realistic about, the fact that we may have to do business with countries that either might not be ESG friendly to certain investors, and Russia's rapidly rising up that list. But or B, we just have to sort of again just reset our expectations for what success looks like, and we can't have our cake and eat it too from all of these perspectives without stepping into a much larger hornet's nest of supply chain craziness, right?
Yeah, it seems like, and you hit on this, and I've really wanted to see some analysis. I'm sure it's out there, but I would love to see all the announced and or pledged goals, whether that be for EVs with the car manufacturers, battery storage, just the energy transition in general. It seems like we're throwing out all these lofty goals, even like the net zero pledges in the 2040, 2050 stuff. Is there anyone out there that's done like a meaningful supply chain analysis to show where we're at today and where we need to be on the mining front? Because it just seems intuitively like this is a paradigm shift, and we're going to have to do a lot more mining worldwide, it would seem like, to get to these goals.
Yeah, We are. So my former colleagues at WoodMac, my former boss, Julian Kettle, put out a paper. I want to say it was maybe it might have been December of 2020. I can't really remember. But in it, I want to say that in order to make that 1.5 degrees Celsius transition, they have an entire unit of their business that's dedicated to analyzing the energy transition. I think in order to get there, we would need to capitalize something like $5 trillion, possibly more now because inflation has been so high, but at least $5 trillion worth of mining finance over the next, call it 2 years, 3 years, because it takes 7 years or more, sometimes 10, to bring on a new mining operation. So if you're not financing that now,
Right.
it's not going to be there in 10 years when you need it. So $5 trillion worth of finance needed. And if you compare that to the prior cycle, I think the prior cycle was something like 500 billion. So it's an order of magnitude higher. And it has to be done yesterday. Like, to me, that's frightening to continue down a path that is underfunded. Either one of two things has got to happen. Either, countries around the world have got to, fully commit to it, fully commit to, helping capitalize the operations that lie within their borders, helping companies get set up, to get initial overburden removal done, or to, streamline drilling programs if we're exploring. But all this has got to be coordinated at a global level and deployed soon. And I don't really see that happening. So absent, the sun, the moon, and Jupiter all lining up, and the world, all, miraculously all getting on the same page, I think it's a better and more pragmatic approach to just say, look, here's what we have, in the near term, and here's how we can get through the next 3 years. And at least from my perspective, that involves, coal production, in the power sector. That involves blast furnace production as opposed to electric arc furnace production here over the next few years. That involves maybe we don't sell as many electric vehicles as we probably should here in the next 2 to 3 years. Or alternately, we bring on, or incentivize bringing on additional production from regions that have enough resources. It's one or the other. We can't have our cake and eat it too. We have to, if we're going to operate from an end goal, we should at least do the world a service and extrapolate back to right now and figure out the 2 to 3 best steps that we can take over the next 2 years, 3 years, and then take them aggressively.
Does this change the U.S.'s view on mining? I mean, I know that we've been in decline as a country for mining. I can't remember who I had a guest on that said that in maybe the early 90s, we were one of the leaders in the world, and then we've just kind of fallen off a cliff from regulatory reasons. Do you see us ever coming back and starting to permit new mines and getting after it, or do we have even the resources here? I'm just not that well versed in the U.S. and our history of mining, and what if can we do anything into the future to become a major player again? To some extent we're doing it. I mean, we granted permits and restarted the rare earths mine out in California. That's MP Materials, former Molycorp. I mean, really from a geological perspective, kind of a terrible deposit. But at current concentrate prices, like it's going and it makes money and it's got escape velocity. If we also support the project that's going to, reshore processing capacity for rare earths, like those are steps in the right direction, even though it's not, it might not be the best mining operation in the world. That's one way in which, we're okay. I mean, we do have, some decent copper deposits here in the U.S. There are some longer term projects that have been on, in some level of development or ideation for a long time. We produce, copper and gold out of the Carlin Trend in Nevada. So there are places in the U.S. There's certainly places in Canada. Canada's incredibly resource rich. That we can go and produce in jurisdictions that are friendly, that will be supportive of the North American market,
that are all run by North American companies. So I think over the next probably, call it a decade, I think you'll see a bit of a shift in, out of necessity with regard to funding mining operations. I think you will see a bit of a change. I don't know if that's necessarily going to happen on the coal side. I think, by and large for hydrocarbons, that narrative has kind of left the market. And I think now we're challenged to, to sort of put forth a narrative like, look, especially with oil and gas, you can't erase, unless you erase plastic, you can't erase oil and gas demand. Coal in 30, 40 years, is that going to be a larger part of the generation mix? Probably not here, but it will be elsewhere. So, the U.S. just transitions from, a domestically driven market to an export driven market. And companies, that are publicly traded now are already in the process of thinking about that transition over time. One of my friends was at the BMO Capital Markets conference in Miami not long ago, and the CEO of Glencore was giving a speech, and somebody asked him, well, if governments ask you, will you increase production, for these operations, will you do so? And he emphatically said, no, we're not going to. We agree with you from a carbon perspective that we want to adhere to the Paris Climate Accord. So we're going to wind down these operations over the next 20, 30 years. That's what you wanted us to do then. That's what we're going to do now. We have to make plans this far out in order to do that. And I don't think that's maybe the best way to sort of remarket that idea back to the liberal wing of the United States legislature. But by the same token, I think that is a message that they'll be forced to get over the course of the next decade. And I do think there are minds to change within that cohort of folks, right? The nuclear crowd is largely very progressive, but they're also acutely aware of the material shortage that we have. So there are people out there who have the expertise, who have the communication skills necessary to pass that knowledge back on to democratic leadership. And I do think I do think we're going to see a change over time. I don't know if we're going to see a change in the next year or so, just because that's in order to get elected this past cycle, we had to have this sort of coalition of moderates and progressives, and they had to agree on a path forward. So I think they're pot committed right now, and how they become unpot committed is by dint of seeing supply chain problems in action in real time. I mean, that's what changes people's minds. It's when reality just comes and slaps you in the face, and we have to deal with those problems as they come up. And we're starting to do that, and it kind of stinks, but also I think it's necessary.
Yeah. We have to have those conversations and be realistic. People want to transition to different types of energy sources, but they don't understand the complexities and the nuances of what it takes to do that. And then we go through this kind of not in my backyard is the theme in the U.S. around not wanting to have industrial processes here, whether it be mining, oil and gas, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Yet we need these things if you want to transition to this future that's mostly mining based. We need to make sure we have security around that. And then to hear the administration come out and say we got to ramp up our reliance on green tech and renewables, and that way we can be more secure. It's like, Russia produces a lot of these metals and things that we need, and so does China, and so do other countries that we don't control. Yeah. And so you're basically saying we can't rely on them, but we're going to rely on them. And it's like, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So there needs to be education around it. And then there needs to be a thoughtful discussion on what we are willing to stomach. Do you want to mine in your backyard and you're in Colorado, or do you want an oil well or a gas well? Well, so you start picking one of these, right? Because we need these things to be able to power the future. We can't just have wishes and dreams for these things. So, but one thing we talked about with you and I, and go ahead, you can respond on that comment, and then I'll go to the next topic.
Oh, no, that's fine. You can go ahead and ask the next one.
Well, I was going to say, one thing we talked about, and we're getting close to the end of the hour, and be mindful of your time, but one thing you and I discussed, and I loved it because I've got a background in music, and I credit my music background to helping me and a lot of things that people wouldn't maybe imagine. And the other day I tweeted, I said, like, creativity is a very undervalued trait in business, maybe one of the more correlated traits to success. Just your thoughts on your background in music, and you and I had mentioned just kind of like, music is sort of how do you take chaos and turn it into order, and be able to turn something that's chaotic, whether it be a bunch of different sounds, and turn it into something that's beautiful. And I think that trait is a skill set that not everybody has. But just your thoughts in general on music and how that's helped you navigate the world of energy and in mining.
Yeah, well, so it does a couple of things. One is that you have to pay attention to the idea, right? When you start picking at an idea from a creative perspective, and you begin to peel away the layers, like what you start to understand is like how that idea relates to other ideas, right? So in music, if we're writing a song, doesn't matter what key. I mean, I know what chords go with that. We're in G, it's G and A minor and B minor and C and D and E minor and F sharp half diminished. And in general, like those, we move through the cycle of fifths in some way. That's where our ears want to go, right? We go from 2 to 5 to 1, or 6 to 2 to 5 to 1, or variations therein. And so when you have sort of a broader idea, you have to go, okay, well, where does this melody, that idea that I have, kind of fit in with this chord or this chord progression? And then when I move to where I think the melody is going to go, what chord sort of goes best with that? So you start to make changes and then adjust, your idea sort of as you go, and it allows you to sort of follow an idea down a rabbit hole really, really deeply until you're kind of at the base of what makes a song or whatever relevant. And when I started working with data in particular and on coal, and then when Russia happened, for instance, now all of a sudden people don't want to take Russian exports. Well, it's sort of like, okay, well, this is the idea. Okay, so we take this one bit. Russia exports 177 million tons of coal, export 30 million tons of met coal. Where does that met coal go? Well, let's go down the rabbit hole. It goes to China, it goes to Japan, it goes to South Korea, it goes to India, it goes to Europe. Okay, well, who doesn't want it? Well, Europe and South Korea and Japan. Okay, well, let's add those up. Let's put this over here. China can take more. India can maybe take a little bit more. And you start to kind of pick away and peel at these trade flows, and then all of a sudden you have this new sort of paradigm. Well, now the trade flows look like they ought to move, X amount of Canada going to South Korea. More U.S. coal is going to go to Europe and Brazil in this scenario. To me, those two ideas are not mutually exclusive, right? Music taught me how to take something and stick with it and follow it until you reach some sort of sense of conclusion, right? So much of music is building up tension, and then 5 goes to 1, so goes back to do, and then a lot of what I used to tell guitar students is like, if you bend a note, in the blues scale, it's like just a little bit out of tune, and people are like, that doesn't sound quite right, and then you resolve it. Everything kind of relaxes. Well, markets work like that too, right? We have an event that takes markets out of tune, and then it takes a while physically to put everything sort of back in order. And that kind of organized, that introduction of chaos and then the resolution of that chaos back into order is kind of how I'm still amazed that the world sort of works. And you can find this analogy in all of these different things. And then I think the other thing it taught me was, when you're on an idea that's particularly hard, it's okay to, sort of set it down and come back to it and pick it up. It's okay to take a really laborious process with it. Music teaches people work ethic. I know sort of culturally that may not make sense to a lot of people, but to see an idea through from beginning to end, or to react in, if you're a jazz musician, you're reacting in real time to inputs that other people are giving you, like that skill set is completely and totally transferable from that medium to a different medium. I think we talked when you got to doing the podcast, recording. Well, Control C and Control V are the same in Excel as they are in Pro Tools, as they are in video software, right? So copy paste, cuts is always the same. The idea of nonlinearity within a broader linear framework is something that's really important in math. It's really important in music. It's really important in creative editing. It's really important in markets and trade flows. Like the understanding that you can learn something by learning a completely different discipline and bring that idea back to the table so that you wind up with this lattice work of interconnected knowledge. When you get to the point in your career when you sort of realize that, like, holy cow, what a powerful moment that was for me. When I realized, it wasn't that I really wanted to be a doctor when I grew up, or a baseball player, or a physician, or a musician, or like a coal market analyst. What I really like to do is solve problems. See ball, hit ball. Right. Okay, well, you don't feel good. What's wrong with this? Well, this chord doesn't sound right. What would be the right chord? This production moment doesn't sound right. What would be right? These trade flows look all messed up. Where is the world going to find its coal from? To me, those are at this point in time in my career, those are just kind of different sides of the same coin. And it's not something that a lot of people kind of get to experience. And I feel really fortunate to have come, from that background into this one, because it's, this market that we all sort of work in, whether it's energy or metals and mining or the broader industrial market, or how that interacts with consumers, right? Because consumers at the end of the day drive all this. If you're aware of how we're all kind of interconnected, how those industries are interconnected, you can really do the world some good. And I do think that we're coming into a point in time, in the world energy evolution that is going to need a whole lot of folks, like ourselves, who know a thing or two about, how the world and energy markets are put together, to become, a more vocal part of global leadership with regard to those things.
That was brilliant. I couldn't have said it any better. Matt, I'm really happy that you came on. For people, tell people where they can find you.
Sure. Well, you can find me on Twitter at MFWarder, MFWarder. And also you can reach me at mwarder@seawolfresearch.com on the emails, as it were. I don't really have a website because I'm a small operation and we're kind of functioning at capacity all the time. But please feel free to reach out to me. My DMs are open. You can reach me via email, and we do consulting work up and down the natural resource space. I just completed a project for a helium producer in the Hugoton Basin. I'm starting on one for a green hydrogen producer here, which is very topical and very interesting, and sort of dovetails back into steel and electricity generation, and aluminum, which one topic we didn't cover today that is also vitally important with regard to Russian supply. So we do a little bit of everything. Also consult to the retail newsletter industry. We do search interest forecasts from that are based off of macroeconomic outlooks, and that's usually helpful for business planning for those types of folks. So it's a really interesting mix of work, and we're really happy to be a part of it. And please, everyone, feel free to reach out.
All right, Matt. Thanks again. I appreciate you coming on the show. It's a great episode.
All right, Max. Thanks for having me. I appreciate you having me on.